Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part 5 as we look at the Gospel of John, where we should finish up. And we left off with the Passion narrative, so let's move into the crucifixion. Woman, behold your son. This is a scene found only in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is, of course, crucified, and the beloved disciple, traditionally John, takes his mother Mary up to the foot of the cross, and Jesus says to her, Woman, behold your son, and then turns to the beloved disciple and says, Behold your mother. And this is one of the reasons why in traditional Christian theology, Mary is viewed as the new Eve. And then continuing forward here, break their legs, get them off the cross, the Sabbath's coming. I talked about this a little bit in, I believe, was the lecture over the Gospel of Mark, which was the first of the canonical Gospels that I did, where, of course, someone who is crucified, there's the passage in Deuteronomy in the Torah, cursed are those that hang on a tree. So, you had to bury them almost immediately after death. I mean, in Judaism, burial usually takes place 24 hours after death, but in this case, you had to bury them quickly. But the Sabbath was coming, and of course, you're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath. So they're informed to have, the people who are being crucified along, side Jesus, and Jesus himself would have been factored in this too, break their legs, get them off the cross. The Sabbath's coming because one of the ways, I mean, how specifically, you die by crucifixion, or one of the ways that you die by crucifixion is that your lungs ultimately collapse. But one of the ways that, prevents that for at least a while is getting air into the lungs. And you can do that by, moving up and down with, of course, the use of their legs or your legs. But if your legs are broken, you can't do that. So it hastens the death. And that was essentially what, um, you know, Jewish authority figures were wanting the Romans to do. In the case with Jesus, his legs were not broken because he was shown to be already dead, but a soldier took a lance and pierced his side, and when he did so, blood and water came out of Jesus' side. So look a little bit here at the resurrection and then the extended ending of John. Have here, woman, why do you weep? In the resurrection narrative from John, Mary Magdalene, arrives at the tomb. She doesn't find Jesus. So she goes and informs the disciples, and Peter and the beloved disciple run to the tomb. They can't find Jesus, and they're uncertain what to think about all this. There is the reference of how they didn't understand that he had to rise from the dead. And so Mary Magdalene is sitting there essentially all alone, and she starts weeping. And this individual that she thought was a gardener working in the area of the cemetery, you could say, says, Woman, why do you weep? And Mary says, they've taken my Lord away from me. I don't know where he is. Please help me find him. And that's when the person that she thought was a gardener says, Mary. And then Mary realizes it's Jesus. And, she says, Rabboni, which translates to rabbi. And Jesus says, No, don't touch me, Mary. I have not yet, ascended to my Father, to your Father, to my God, and to your God. But then, continuing further, the resurrected Christ gives his disciples, the apostles, this statement: receive the Holy Spirit. Whomever sins you forgive are forgiven. Whomever sins you retain are retained. This relates to the sacrament of reconciliation that's commonly referred to as confession. One of the traditional seven sacraments. Within Protestantism, it was ultimately rejected as a sacrament, although there are some Protestant churches that do maintain the ritual of it, but they don't consider it to be a sacrament. But regardless of which, um, the notion here, the theology, you could say, behind it is that, of course, Jesus, he gives it to the apostles, in reference here, this passage in the Gospel of John, and then the apostles, by the laying on of hands, transfers it to their successors, who are commonly known as bishops. The laying on of hands, which refers to the sacrament of ordination. You see this in the pastorals, letters to Timothy and Titus. And then the bishops, and it also can come from the apostles too, that those that help them in celebrating the sacraments, presbyters, who in contemporary English are referred to as priests, but the word literally means elder or old man, are also given this. But notions of, whomever sins you forgive are forgiven, whomever sins you retain are retained, kind of mentions something about that. Let's say that you go to receive the sacrament of reconciliation, and we'll say that the celebrant is a presbyter or priest. And you mentioned how you got angry and, you beat your wife or something like that. And the presbyter um, gives the words of absolution, which, according to the theology, God or Jesus Christ actually forgives the sins through the celebrant. He himself doesn't actually do anything by his own power. It's God or Jesus Christ working through him. But anyway, then let's say the following week you come back and you're like, well, I got angry again. I did the same thing. I beat my wife. So, once again, the celebrant, gives the words of, absolution. Excuse me again. Well, then let's say now the following week, so this would be week 3, you come back and you did the same thing again. Well, this time the celebrant says, no, you're not getting anything. That's a power that the celebrant would have coming from this particular passage. Whomever sins you forgive are forgiven, whomever sins you retain are retained. And then moving forward here, chapter 20, it marks the end of the Gospel of John. Chapter 21 is an extended ending of the Gospel, possibly due to what is referenced in John 21, verses 20 through 23, and this was written sometime in the early 2nd century. I focused on this at the start of my lecture over the Gospel of John, but I want to read some portions of this here. This is coming from the end of chapter 20. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. Well, that's a closing, that's an ending. So chapter 21 is an extended of that. And here is more than likely the reason for behind this. I'm going to read here from verse 20 through 23. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? Jesus said to him, If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? So, what is there to be said there? The beloved disciple there, who traditionally is viewed as John, although there are some challenges to that, but mentioned that this was the person that reclined next to Jesus at the supper. I stated how John's gospel does not have a Last Supper setting, but it does have a reference to, a supper, but there's no narrative. And more than likely, that was the Last Supper, but John doesn't provide, any narrative or any details about it, just mentions there was a supper and that this was the person that was next to Jesus. But apparently, there was an understanding that this individual would not die until Jesus returned. And what ended up happening? Well, he died. And so, chapter 21 was essentially addressing his death. That apparently people thought he wouldn't die, but then he ended up dying. And so, you need to address this. And that's why, I kind of factored in, John being the beloved disciple a little bit with my dates. And that's why I stated how that passage was written sometime in the early second century, and I gave within the first decade of the second century. And then one last bit here. Peter is rehabilitated. Unique position is referenced, and so is his death. One of the things that Jesus does in this extended ending is, he asks Peter, Peter, do you love me? As much as do you love me? And he asks him the question three times, kind of in reference to the three that Jesus betrayed Peter three times, or Peter betrayed Jesus three times. But his unique position is referenced there too. Feed my lambs, feed my sheep. But there's also the reference to his death. How, one day you're going to go where you don't want to go. You're going to stretch out your hands, and this is how you're going to glorify God. And of course, the author would have been well aware of Peter's death, that he was executed by crucifixion in Rome, in Nero's circus in Rome. Traditionally, Peter was crucified upside down, but that may be a little bit of early Christian piety, but he was most certainly crucified. That's pretty well documented. And the author would have been well aware of that, and the notion of stretching out his arms would reflect that concept. Well, that's essentially all that we have for the Gospel of John. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Till then, take care.